Okay, folks, if we could move towards our chairs, we will get our meeting under order. And as this is actually a meeting of the Corporate Services Committee, I will dispense of the preliminaries of any disclosures of pecuniary interest. Great, that was fast. Karen, welcome.
Thank you, and I apologize for being late.
No, you're just in time. Thank you.
Longer than I expected for that today.
So we have a full agenda with us today, and I do want to welcome each of our members of Parliament with us. Thank you so much. I know how challenging it is to get all of our schedules to align, and I trust that both our schedules are aligning, our agendas are aligning, and maybe even the planets as well. So thank you for making the time. And also to my colleagues on council, thank you for being here this afternoon. I'm going to turn it over now and ask our mayor to bring greetings.
Great. Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor Hubert. I'm going to keep my greetings short. Welcome back to the seat of your local government. We're very excited to have you here. You can see that we have a committee of 6 and also some guests here as well, the other members of council. I know we're all looking forward to discussions about city building initiatives and efforts that we all share as common goals. And I know we look forward to that because we talk on a very, very regular basis. It's nice to be able to do this in a formal setting when we can, but you have all worked so hard to have a strong relationship with the City of London and with councillors and with myself that I want to say thank you for that. So Kate and Peter and Irene and Karen, welcome to your community, welcome home. We're really excited about having some conversations, and I do hope that as we work our way through this formal agenda, there will be at least as much time for you to ask questions of us as we are asking questions of you. This really should be, I think, a discourse that is very, very equal from an information sharing perspective, and I know that Deputy Mayor Hubert, as he chairs the meeting, will keep that in mind as well. And so there is an agenda, but if you want to move in a different direction, by all means, let's keep this in the kind of working relationship that we've all established with one another in among that kind of focus. So welcome, and colleagues, I know we were up late last night at council. Thank you for making time in the day as well to be back for this meeting too.
Well, thank you, Mayor. And just by virtue of that, we are going to start with our City Manager, Martin Hayward, who I can't see. But we've crafted this agenda in a little different way than we've done our agendas in the past. Today we want to talk about the story. And the story is about a place called the City of London. And we really want to have a time of talking about what is happening and how our story is emerging. And so I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Hayward to tell you from an administration's point of view some of the elements of that story and what is happening in our community. And then we'll introduce the 3 topics that we're going to look at today. Mr. Hayward, Martin, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I just want to mention what is on your desk in front of you, what we've given out. We've given you a copy of the presentation. We've given you a summary copy of the notes from my speaking notes for the presentation. And we also have provided you with a pre-budget submission that we submitted to the federal government for the budget. And then finally, there is a copy of the agenda and some summary notes of that pre-budget submission. So just so you know what you got in front of you, obviously council members will be familiar with the pre-budget submission having come through you. So one of the things I'd like to do is talk about the work that we undertake here. It's all grounded in our strategic plan, and as everyone knows, the 2015 to 2019 strategic plan identifies a shared vision, mission, and strategic focus that guide the work of council and the civic administration over this council term. The vision, push the wrong button. The vision for the city is to be a leader in commerce, culture and innovation, our region's connection to the world. And I think council debated long and hard over that vision, and it speaks to really what we're trying to hit on. And included in the plan is the 4 strategic areas of focus: strengthening our community, building a sustainable city, growing our economy, and leading in public service. And what I'd like to do right now is highlight in each of those 4 areas some of the accomplishments, acknowledge the support of the federal government in certain areas, and also look at opportunities where we can collaborate together more. So starting with strengthening our community. The city is investing in strong neighborhoods throughout, through neighborhood plans, through decision-making, and providing services right where people live. We've fully now decentralized our social services with a total of 6 sites across the community. Our first neighborhood decision-making vote day is taking place this Saturday, and that's quite exciting, as Ms. Livingston can share. London is also a diverse, inclusive and welcoming community, and we're happy to say that we welcomed over 1,200 Syrian refugees since 2016. On the housing front, the Housing Development Corporation has leveraged federal, provincial and municipal dollars to create opportunities the city and London Middlesex Housing Corporation could not pursue directly. For every dollar in public housing public funding for housing, it allows the HDC to leverage an additional dollar from the private sector. Also, London's Housing First approach has contributed to a 21% decrease in individuals accessing shelter services between 2011 and 2015. I recently had the opportunity to sit with Ms. Livingston and Jan Richardson, and there's some really exciting individual stories that we can share, and it's really quite touching when you see somebody going from a state of hopelessness and homelessness to standing outside a polling booth, participating in an election, having a home. And so that's something that we're trying to achieve on the ground every day, and these kind of approaches help us. We'd like to acknowledge and thank our federal colleagues for their contribution towards Social Infrastructure Fund, which has recently expanded to 2018 and 2019 with a contribution of $2.5 million. This has allowed the City of London to leverage additional funding to create up to 75 more safe and affordable housing units. We'd also like to thank you for your contributions to programs like the Reno and Retrofit program. This is administered by CMHC, and it provides much needed infrastructure funding to our community federal housing co-ops. Through this program, approximately $856,000 will be directly spent to improve housing conditions for more than 200 households in London. So I think there's some pretty exciting stuff that we're doing with this. I'd also like to acknowledge that the Homeless Partnering Strategy Review is critical to ensuring all communities receive the resources they need to make progress towards eliminating homelessness. One of the opportunities that we have in this particular focus area is the mental health and addiction strategy. It goes beyond the borders of London, and it will no doubt require resources and advocacy at all levels of government to ensure we move forward in meaningful progress that help this vulnerable area of our community. And so that's an area that we see that it could be really increased collaboration, and offer that as a suggestion. Building a sustainable city. One of the things we have is a beautiful Thames Valley Parkway. It's 42 kilometers long. In addition, it links over 150 kilometers of additional pathways that connect all corners of London. It's a key element of our active transportation network and ensures safe, attractive transportation options no matter how you travel. So if you bike, rollerblade, skateboard, walk, run. And this year we were able to link the South Branch with the rest of the network at Kiwanis Park, which provides greater access to our community. While the city also doesn't have control over energy prices, we do have some influence. Our community energy plan has led to meaningful reductions in energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, which I know is something that's important to the federal government. From expanding our fleet of electric vehicles to investing in solar power to innovation in waste management and transit, the city is taking the lead on reducing energy use, and I think that's good news. One element that has been had particularly wide-reaching and regional implications is our domestic action plan for reduction of phosphorus in the Thames River. In 2014, 500,000 people in Toledo, Ohio, went without water as a result of an algae bloom in Lake Erie. And without serious coordinated effort, the problems will only get worse. London is committed to doing our part to ensure healthy waterways and preventing toxic algae blooms in the Great Lakes. Again, acknowledging some of the federal government investments in our community, we'd like to acknowledge the Canada 150 Community Infrastructure Program. The fund has supported enhancements that will last for generations, and that includes improvements to our parks, our community destinations like Victoria Park Cenotaph and the Thames Valley Parkway, specifically the connection in the South Branch of the Kiwanis Park that I mentioned earlier. We'd also like to acknowledge that the Federal Gas Tax Fund is helping us to rehab our historically significant Blackfriars Bridge, for which there's an event of removal tomorrow as it gets rehabbed. Opportunities exist to collaborate in that while the city is doing its part to move forward on the domestic action plan for phosphorus reduction, the enormous scale and widespread impacts of phosphorus issue mean that all governments must continue to work together. This is not just a local issue or a provincial issue or a national issue. This is an international issue when you consider that we live in the Great Lakes and we share the border of those lakes with the US. In terms of growing our economy, our accomplishments, although this one isn't an accomplishment, cities don't create jobs, but we do create an environment for businesses to grow and thrive, and we're certainly attempting to do that here with our industrial land development strategy and with some of the changes that we're doing to our Service London business hub and investments in LEDC. To attract the next generation businesses and highly skilled workforce, we know we need to provide 21st century infrastructure in areas like rapid transit and fiber internet. And we also need to have high quality fundamental infrastructure like roads and water. Some facts about some of our sectors. London's tech sector, which barely existed 10 years ago, is now our 5th largest employer, adding over 2,000 jobs in the past 2 years alone. 80% of our labor market comes from businesses with fewer than 100 employees, and there are roughly 14,000 individual businesses operating in our city, adding over $15 billion worth of GDP to the London and region economy. London's long history in innovation in medicine has resulted in a thriving health sciences sector, directly employing over 24,000 people and generating research and expertise that is transformative on a global scale. And one of the things we're trying to enhance there is the commercialization of some of those ideas so they stay in this area. London seeks to contribute to regional and national opportunities at every opportunity, and recently the city provided data and information to support the ongoing NAFTA negotiations. We'd like to thank the federal government for the $38 million investment in our community through the PTIF, or Public Transit Infrastructure Fund. $11 million of that went to the Shift Environmental Assessment and Engineering, and $16 million towards the Dundas Place, which is coming up for rebuild next year and the year after. We also received $20 million in the Clean Water Wastewater Fund, and this funding is supporting projects that will prevent flooding, save energy, and extend the life of our clean water systems. And I think we recently had a tour of Greenway, where you saw some of that investment being used. We'd also want to acknowledge the federal government for allowing municipalities to have a voice in the NAFTA negotiations and for making it a simple process to participate in submitting that information as well. In terms of opportunities for collaboration, the bilateral agreements are signed to establish specifications for phase 2, or as they're signed to provide those specs for phase 2 of investing in Canada. We'll need a Team London approach to championing London's projects. As we work to understand municipalities' role in the national conversation on growing our economy, collaborations between governments is key. And I see that specifically when we start to attract industries from other parts of the world or major relocates of headquarters and things like that. I think this is an area that we could really work together on. Aligning our efforts to attract business and grow a talented workforce will also support London, a strong London and a strong Canada. Finally, leading in public service. And this first one's going to sound a little self-serving, but the City of London has a history of sound financial management, and I didn't write that piece. But this year we received the highest possible credit rating from Moody's Investor Service, AAA, stable outlook for the 41st consecutive year, and I think that's really speaks to London and to the work that Council's done with respect to the financial situation here. The city is working hard to ensure that we are also reflective of our diverse community. So earlier this year, City Council unanimously adopted the Community Diversity and Inclusion Strategy. We also recently introduced and launched an intercultural competency program for employees that was focused on enhancing relationships with Indigenous and First Nations partners. So I think that's all very positive. In our most recent citizen satisfaction survey, 87% of Londoners indicated they are satisfied with the overall level of City of London services. Again, good news for the council. We would like to acknowledge our federal partners' continued efforts in advocating for London and also for taking the time to participate in these meetings. A key opportunity here would be to continue to collaborate and work together to advance the priorities of our community, some of which I've tried to celebrate here with you. So I hope you found this update helpful. There's a lot of great work taking place in our organization and across the city. Your continued support, be whether through specific investments in our community, collaborating to advance priorities in the community, or participating in meetings such as today, is greatly appreciated. And we look forward to continuing to work together. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Martin. And that's a bit of a mouthful, and certainly at a very, very high level on many initiatives. And certainly behind those initiatives, there's more action being taken. Just before we move to our first discussion point, let me just throw it open to our colleagues from the federal government to say, was there a question or something that you'd like some clarification on from Martin's presentation? And then we are going to focus particularly on three areas that, you know, I guess with staff kind of cherry picked these one a little bit, where our mental health and addictions, in economic development and environmental sustainability. And we'll have a discussion around there. But is there a question of clarification or something you want to ask Martin further on? He's not going anywhere, but on a particular element that he raised in his presentation.
The AAA credit rating is very, very good. I agree.
Oh, thank you, and thank you, Martin, very much. That was a very precise overview, and I appreciated it very much. And I also appreciate the AAA rating, but correct me if I'm wrong, cities like London that have the AAA rating, are they disadvantaged in as much as they can get better rates borrowing for infrastructure out in the private sector than they can from the infrastructure bank? Is that something that you've heard about, are concerned about? Because we are hearing that if a municipality is having difficulty finding financial support, then they're not going to be able to do the good things that need to happen in regard to infrastructure across the country. Oh, I have power, yes.
Sorry, this is different than the House. We get one speaker and it cuts you off, so.
So through the chair, the infrastructure bank is something that's fairly recent that we have been looking at. There are some specific criteria around it. We did meet with some representatives about that. And at this point in time, it's not necessarily something that we can tap into for some of the projects that we want to do, because the threshold is a lot higher than we have at this point. So we are exploring it, though, down the road, and we made some suggestions, which they did take back with them. So in terms of our ability to get funding, one of the keys for us is managing the amount of debt that we have outstanding, and that allows us in a planned way, along with our infrastructure plan, maintenance plan, to make sure that we do keep things up to date. Where we would struggle is on new big initiatives, and I won't mention the one that we are looking at right now. So,
Thank you. Mayor, did you want to make a comment?
I just wanted to say thank you to Mr. Hayward for that presentation. Mr. Hayward and his team have been working impossibly hard over the past 8 months. I think it's been now, Mr. Hayward, since you've been in the role. And he didn't mention that he was a former treasurer once. He alluded to it, but it doesn't quite cross the line of having to give $20 to a charity of his choice. There were some really key messages from Mr. Hayward's presentation, and that was highlighting all of the incredible work that we're already doing together. And it focuses around the London Plan, how we want to grow as a community over the next 20 years. We can't do it without you, and we're already moving in that direction. Think about the investments through Phase 1 funding for rapid transit. When you think about the significant investment from the federal government for Dundas Place, to make that a people place on evenings and weekends and over the course of special events. Couple that with the investment that we've made to bring 2,000 Fanshawe students downtown by 2018. Of course, the water and the wastewater investments that have been made by the federal government are also a key part of the London Plan. One that we don't think about as often, perhaps, is the things that are above the surface. And lastly, our goals for housing. And I know we're all looking forward to the launch of the National Housing Strategy. So I just thought we should highlight as a starting point the great work that's happening already. And when multiple levels of government work together, incredible things can happen. We can't do the London Plan without you. And so thank you again, Mr. Hayward, for that presentation.
Okay, why don't we turn to our first topic, which is around mental health and addictions. And some might say, well, why are we talking with our federal partners? It's more a provincial, municipal thing, but it's all of us together. And at the end of the day, it's one community. We're Londoners first, Ontarians second, and Canadians third, or Canadians first, Ontarians second, and Londoners last. I don't know which it actually is. So, as you heard our city manager mention, we're committed to being innovative in practices in the area of homelessness, and this is National Housing Day, and also in mental health and addictions. It's something that's facing, I think, every community, regardless of where I talk to people, whether it's Calgary, Vancouver, or Halifax. I was with people from across the country last week. It is an issue. And interestingly enough, the people I was with last week are all business leaders of large corporations. So we did a simulation on what advice we would give to the federal government. You know what? And it was a voting mechanism, one of these electronic things we were testing out. The number one piece of advice was around housing. That was the number one thing from a bunch of senior business leaders. So our strategy around community mental health and addictions has developed an advisory council, which is conducting extensive research and consultation. And that's going to be rolled out and made public in December. And so one of the things we'd like to talk about today is, as well, we'll be looking at the recommendations of that. We have an opioid crisis in our community. We have a working group that the London, Middlesex London Health Unit is leading, and we're working with them on. And it's an issue that we can't avoid and we can't ignore. As well as infectious disease rates associated with intravenous drug use have skyrocketed. The rate of HIV infection has doubled in 10 years. And on average, there's over 300 new cases of Hep C annually in our city. So that's a rather bleak picture. And so the question I want to throw out to all of us, and I really see this as a conversation of colleagues, if I could, is how can our governments work together to implement effective strategies to address addiction in our community? And I'll give the second question because I think they bleed together, what I refer to as the unholy trinity of mental health, addictions, and homelessness. Is, you know, one of the first steps of supporting individuals in a crisis is ensuring that they have safe, affordable housing. And how can we have a Team London approach to ensuring that London's needs are recognized? So maybe let's start with how can we effectively address addictions, and just let's have a conversation around that.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here, and these are important topics, and as you say, they all work hand in hand. They're all together, and I know for our part, a national housing strategy is something that we know we have to has to come to fruition, and it will. And I'm looking forward to hearing how that will all break down, and then we'll be able to sit down and really figure out how we can work together. Because certainly when then Health Minister Jane Philpott came to London, I think it was in the summer, we had a great discussion about the opioid crisis, and there again it was talking about homelessness and how all of the problems seem to be linked. And I think we would all agree, if you don't have a home, you don't have a life. And that's where it really starts with. And so it's so important. And I don't think there would be any reason for anyone to say that we don't have a problem here. If anything, it's far worse than I think any of us realized it could get. And it's not going to get better without all of us working together. So I'm very hopeful with the National Housing Strategy that will put into place the framework for all of us to work together and make sure that over the course of the next few years that we will find solutions. And I think that we're on our way, but more needs to be done, and we do need to work together.
Okay, Karen?
Thanks very much. Back in the spring, I was part of the HUMA committee where we traveled across Canada, and I can't remember when was the last meeting that we had with you, because I don't want to be repeating all of my stories.
April, maybe?
April? Okay. So I probably did talk about the issues that I saw out in Maple Ridge and Coquitlam. And basically, the biggest thing that we need is we have the housing partnership, or the housing partnership strategy. We have or the homelessness. We have a variety of things that are going on, but we don't see things going fast enough. That's part of the issue. And a lot of times we're putting money into the housing, but unless there's all the wraparound, things won't work. So putting a person into a shelter, and I've seen this where they're into a shelter, but they're still able to do drugs. We need to make sure that we have opportunities for people to get off the drugs and try to better their lives as well. So if we're putting out a housing strategy, it's very, very important that we also have those wraparound services that include the mental health and include the addiction services that are really, really needed for that. I'm a huge supporter of Housing First, and we've seen, and I see in the statistics here for the City of London, that it has worked. Across the country, we have seen a lot of things, and listening to the different coalitions across the country, they have really focused on the Housing First strategy, saying it's a great basis. Is it perfect? Absolutely not, but we can build on that, and I think it's really, really important that we do that as well. I'm looking forward to this national housing strategy. I don't know what it's going to look like, to be honest. I've heard many different philosophies, what's coming out as the shadow minister. I've been researching it for months and months and months, but we need to make sure that the approach that we do is not federally, it's not from the top down. It has to be done at the grassroots level, because this is where we know the issues are, whether it's the job security issues, whether it's domestic violence issues, a variety of issues that may help work in our communities. So I think it's really imperative that we have solutions on the ground so that we can build from that. When it comes to the addictions, services need to be available for everybody, especially in those Housing First strategies.
And Karen, if I could just follow up. So from a city perspective, if you were giving us advice, and that's really what we're looking for from all of you today, is if you were giving us advice, how would you see the city engaging and interfacing with the national?
Great question. To be
I know
honest.
as a critic, you're supposed to give them advice, but we want your advice.
I give them a lot of advice, actually.
I'm sure.
I work very closely with Duclos, and I have for the last 2 years, so he's a
Yeah.
very excellent man to work with, to be honest. You don't hear that from every Conservative, but he's a really good minister. The biggest advice is making sure that the strategy is built on the ground, so making sure that you're having those partnerships with the mental health institutions, with the police foundations, a variety of groups like that, so that you can see what are the unique needs of your communities, and have an advisory council based on that. You know, I know that there's a motion coming up right now, and I don't want to get too political, but it's M147. It's Sherry Benson's motion of the NDP. And I have, as the critic said, I'm going to be supporting this because we have to look at this homelessness issue. We've talked about it for years, but we don't see it going down as exponentially as we should. So we need to look at the grassroots things, and that's why I'm going to be supporting this motion put forward by the NDP, so that we actually see there's the causes, there's a variety of different impacts that we need to look at, but every single community needs to have their own plan. It may have a protocol saying these are your check boxes, but it needs to have a plan, and we need to have people on the ground, from everything from our police services, having the proper training, to having facilities where there are people advocating for their addictions as well.
And Peter, perhaps you can speak to how do we break down the various silos so that there is that interface happening in your perspective?
Well, Tay is an example, but beyond that, we have, I think over the past 2 years, found a way to certainly engage one another, not just in this chamber, but one-on-one. I know the councillors whose ward is in London North Centre best, but I also have had the chance to get to know councillors whose ward is outside of London North Centre, people like Mr. Usher, Councillor Usher. So that is to answer your question, that's the first way. But I think honest dialogue is the way to go about things. We are less as a society when our most marginalized members are not taken care of. We are less as a society when people on the street are forced to endure, especially in the winter months in this country. We're less when people are forced to continue to have the challenge of drug addiction in their life. And these are problems that those individuals are going through, but problems that those families are going through, problems that the community at large is facing. So to build on that, you asked, Paul, at the outset, you asked about advice. What advice can we give? And I don't know if it's advice, but we certainly want to be partners here, and I think an honest dialogue is important. I would want to hear from your perspective, what are the most significant addictions issues that you've identified as a mayor and as a council? I just recently did a ride-along with the London Police Service. It was a Saturday evening, about 2 or 3 weeks ago now, and it was very eye-opening. I mean, certainly I'm following these issues very closely and engaged in the community and the community organizations. And you hear the stories and you see the stories because we're all elected officials, we're in the community. But when you're out with the police, you recognize, A, the challenge of their job because they're law enforcement, but they've also in effect become mental health practitioners in so many ways. You know, the officer that I had the pleasure of getting to know, Staff Sergeant, has been on the job for 20 years. He said, without question, it's not just an opioid crisis. Fentanyl has started to make its way into the community. That is his real concern. And crystal meth, those two areas. Now, I would like to know from you if you also hold that view. We see this mentioned in the press, but I don't think we've had a dialogue on that. And as far as addressing the issue, we have to have an approach that seeks to look at the issue in the immediate and in the long term. In the immediate, your city is moving along with consultations on safe consumption sites, which is, I think, a very welcome development. The evidence shows that this is a very reasonable way to go about dealing with the sorts of crises that we're talking about from an addictions perspective. But there is a long-term perspective as well, and that's housing. I'm very glad, Paul, that you opened things up and spoke about housing at the outset, because these things are interlinked. If we want to talk about addressing issues of mental health and addictions, we do have to talk about housing. So that's my perspective on this particular issue.
Mayor, just briefly to a couple of the points that Peter's raised, and then I'm going to go to Councillor Park.
Absolutely. To answer your question, what issues do we see from a drug use perspective in our community, you hit them all right on the head. Crystal meth is a very serious issue, and it comes with all kinds of challenges because it's an upper, and it creates policing issues, it creates safety issues, and it creates long-term health issues for users. And you mentioned opioids as well, and we're seeing the opioid epidemic really make its way right across the country. I'm working with mayors from across Canada on a task force through FCM to deal with that. And lastly, fentanyl. And fentanyl is not a drug, it's a poison. And people aren't dying from drug overdose, when they've used something that's laced with fentanyl. They're dying from poison, and they didn't know that they were ingesting it at the time. And so that is a critical focus that, you know, I've sat with your Prime Minister earlier this year and with a number of other mayors, and he agreed this is a crisis and that we need to do something together. So I don't want to take up too much of the time. I know there are other speakers, but would love to speak more about this and what we're doing to address it.
Councillor Park.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm glad that Mr. Fragoscato raised the point of supervised consumption sites and how that discussion's moving along here in the city. I'm curious to know if there's been any discussion at the federal level about how do we progress this going forward on a national level. As you indicated, there's really good research about why this is a way for communities to go to really service the individuals who are facing these traumatic experiences in their lives. I just wonder if there's any conversation about progressing this further for the federal exemption across the country at this point.
Questions to me, I take it, Tanya? Councillor Park, what I would say to that is that we are taking our cue from cities on this. We are actively engaged with cities on these issues. Now, I've had one-on-one conversations with council colleagues whose ward is in London North Centre on the matter, and that will continue. But we have, as a federal government, put in place a process whereby safe consumption sites, if cities choose to go in this direction, it's perfectly appropriate, but there's a federal regime in place, as you know, that has to be adhered to. There's consultations that need to take place, robust consultations with communities, and so that's part of the dialogue. But this is an important issue, and it's a way to deal with the crisis that we see, especially in East Vancouver, but well beyond now, obviously, with what we've heard.
Councillor Usher. Oh, you didn't? Okay, Councillor Squire. And then I'll come over to you, Irene. Sorry, if you could, it's the computer screen that I can't see.
Hi. Since you asked, one of the things that I've noticed is there's a heavy emphasis on the opioid crisis. But in the area that I work, and I represent a lot of mentally ill people, it is amphetamines that are the primary problem, the uppers that people take. And I'm seeing an increased number of people who are suffering from what psychiatrists are calling drug-induced psychosis. In other words, they're ending up in mental health facilities, not because they suffer from a mental illness inherently, but because it's been brought about by drugs. In other words, the drugs have brought about the psychosis. And all that the hospital can do is wait till they reach a certain level where they can go back out into the public. They go back out in the public, and of course they access drugs again, and then right back in the hospital. So it's very expensive to use a mental health facility to treat someone who is really suffering from what is essentially drug abuse. And on the issue of using sites for those people, I think there's a split. Some doctors have said to me that they would love to see safe drug sites where all drugs are used in a proper manner. Others are very worried about that. They worry that mental health patients who come out of a hospital will immediately want to access amphetamines and end up back in a psychiatric facility. So my experience is that it is opioids that get the attention because of the life-threatening nature of taking opioids. But long-term, I still think there's a major problem with amphetamine use.
Okay, Irene.
Yes, thank you. I can see. This is wonderful. I wanted to touch on a couple of things, and certainly the housing issue. And as you know, this has been a key for me for quite a long time. And my concern stems from the fact that we keep hearing about a national housing strategy, and it's not there yet. Now, I've heard that we can expect it at the end of the month, but there's so many questions we can't seem to get answered. And I wondered if you've been able to ask these questions and get these answers. But first and foremost, the strategy apparently is going to use the term affordable. What does that mean? Does that mean a small bachelor apartment? Does that mean a condo? And how does that translate into the needs of families where they need something substantive, not something very small because it fits the definition of affordable? Nothing's been earmarked for social housing. And I note that in the documents, you talk about social housing in conjunction with affordable. You need nearly 3,200 households are on a wait list for social housing. And further down, you talk about needing $225 million for maintenance, repairs, and replacement of city-owned affordable and social housing. And that seems to be a great deal more than the monies that you were talking about. So FCM has been very vocal about this. It's been overdue in terms of the needs of not just this community, but every community across the country. So are you hearing on the ground what will be available? Because we're not. Now, I know it's $11.2 billion over 11 years. That bothers me too. 11 years is a long time, and that goes well beyond the mandate of this government. So that, and you've also indicated that you're doing a dedicated response to local veterans experiencing chronic and persistent housing needs. So where are you on that? And I have a whole lot of other questions, but in relation to some other things. But let's start with the housing and the fact that we believe in my caucus that you have to have a framework. Right? You need to have a framework for that and the poverty issue. And I'll come back to the poverty issue after I hear from some folks.
Thank you, Irene. Mr. Hayward or Ms. Dieters-Bears, do we have any early indications, or what are we hearing on the ground per se on this particular topic?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We had an opportunity today to meet with colleagues from Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and we pushed them a bit for the date of the National Housing Strategy to be released. We believe it to be imminent. That's what they've told us on the ground as of, I think, probably about 2 hours ago. And we are looking forward to what that means for our community in terms of developing affordable housing along a continuum of affordability. And we're hoping that those funds will help both to address the issues we have in our social housing stock, but also in the development of new affordable housing through our Housing Development Corporation.
Thank you. And I would draw your attention that in our pre-budget submission, there is a section on social and affordable housing, and that the city is seeking over a 10-year, $20 million investment from the federal government over and above the existing. So that's in your package. Peter?
If I could, I know that you might be tempted to go on to the next topic here, but if I could, I want to commend both my colleagues actually for raising housing and taking it seriously. I think we all take it seriously. I know all of you take it seriously. But we do need to get this right. We do have to consult with cities and understand their particular needs. We have to consult with experts to ensure that the policy is rolled out in an effective way. I'm also in a rush because I think, and the government is as well from one perspective, because we see the problems. We know that housing is the way to address those challenges, but how would we feel if the federal government was to impose, after the election, let's pretend we're in 2015 now, if we imposed a national housing strategy without consulting, without listening? Minister Duclos was here a few weeks ago. Mayor, you sat with him, and city officials were in the room as well. He was able to hear the concerns from those in the room about what, and various community leaders were in the room present. That was an effective dialogue. That informs the strategy. It is upon us. We are heading towards it, but we have to get it right, and that takes time.
Okay. Thank you. I think what we'll do is pivot to our next topic, if I could, and which is around economic development. And sometimes one of the best strategies for poverty is obviously having a healthy and vibrant economy. And Mr. Hayward identified many of the elements that are happening. I want to draw your attention just to a couple to reiterate them. One is our tech sector. 10 years ago, our tech sector was minuscule. And today, it's our 5th largest employer, adding over 2,000 jobs in the last couple of years alone. Obviously, we have a long history of medical innovation, and Councillor Helmer drew our attention last night to World Diabetes Day, and that this is, as much as Toronto and the University of Toronto wants to say that it was discovered there, let's not forget where the intelligence came to make it happen. It came from London, so we can take a little bit of credit on that one. And obviously, infrastructure is important because there's a direct link between infrastructure and economic development. So we all have a role in this, and certainly our role is to set the table, if you were, make sure we have a business-friendly environment. We have offered both information assistance on significant national priorities, and I'll name just one, NAFTA, and free trade agreements that I know are top of mind for many of us, certainly in southwestern Ontario. There's an upside and a potential downside there. So what comments would you have? Once again, how do we take a Team London approach in the area of economic development? What advice would you have for us? What observations? And you get them coming into your constituencies' offices, as much as they come into our offices. What are you hearing? What can we do? And where do we go from here? I'll start with Kate this time, and then I'll go to Irene, because Irene was last the last time, okay? Kate?
Well, thank you. Economic development and infrastructure do go hand in hand. And we talked earlier about mental health and housing, and I think they all do dovetail very nicely. And so it's certainly important for us to work together. And I think there's no question that London is well on the way to hopefully getting the federal dollars that are necessary for the infrastructure projects. And certainly I know that we've continued discussions, and we want to make sure that we're informed of what the city plan is as far as infrastructure is concerned, and make sure that we're well aware, not only for us to be able to go back to Ottawa and say, this is what London needs, but we also need to be able to tell our constituents, this is what London is planning to do. And those are the questions that we get asked as members of Parliament. And I'll speak for myself, but I know even though I'm a member of Parliament for London West, I'm still a member of Parliament for all of London. I want all of London to be successful. But when I go door to door, and when I talk to people in London West, they're still concerned about where the infrastructure is going, how the infrastructure dollars are going to help them. And that's what I need from the City of London. I need to be able to tell my constituents that the infrastructure dollars that are coming from the federal government are actually going to help them. Because in London West, of course, the BRT isn't as much of an issue. It's more in making sure that the LTC, that the future of the LTC is strong, and that it's going to be able to work well with BRT. And those are the questions that I need answers to. And I think that's something at this point when you're moving into another consultation phase. These are the questions that you need to answer. And certainly I know there are concerns about timing, but I think it's important that you really listen and make sure that you're hearing from constituents, and make sure that you are giving them the time necessary to give you the feedback. I know you have the dates already planned for the middle of December. Little concerned about that because I'm very concerned that people are going to be very busy in December, and they need time to be able to give you the advice and the input that they need to give you, and they need to be heard, and they need to feel that they're being heard. So I'll leave that with you. There's a lot there, but those are the main things that I wanted to get out on the table. Thank you.
Thanks for those comments. I'm going to go to Irene, and I do have Phil and Josh on the docket, and the mayor.
Well, thank you, Chair. And of course, the infrastructure piece is very, very important. We know, for example, for every dollar invested, there is a significant return, as much as 30% or perhaps even 35%. So it's key to the kind of economic development that you want to do here, not just the hard infrastructure, but the social infrastructure. That is very, very important. One of the things that concerns me is that the infrastructure is being funded by an infrastructure bank that has a private and a privatization component. And I worry about that investment by entrepreneurs requiring a payback in terms of tolls or a user fee. So I raise that caution, and I'm also concerned about the fact that those infrastructure dollars are flowing very, very slowly. And in fact, the Parliamentary Budget Officer has identified that we're about $5 billion behind. And if we want to get projects off the ground, then that has to be timely. And the suggestion has been made to use models from the past, like the models that have been successful, the gas tax, for example, a successful model, but get something in place that is going to work, that is going to move those dollars. I do have some questions in that regard. We are hearing about the need for that hard infrastructure, and I mentioned social infrastructure. One of the things that people, I think, look at when they're attracted to a place to invest and a place to live are what are the cultural opportunities. And so I wanted to know, what is it that London needs in regard to cultural and community needs, things like music, film, theater, whatever it is, because that translates into jobs too. And is there a sufficient amount of money for cultural spaces? I didn't see anything in regard to money for recreation, and that is an important key in regard to that. Plus, predictability. You need predictability in terms of your planning and that funding. And so are you getting reliable timeframes in connection with that infrastructure funding? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Councillor Squire, and then we'll go to Karen, and then we'll come over to you, Councillor Morgan, okay?
I want to ask you about something that's entirely within this federal sphere, and that's connectivity and transportation between cities. And since you're looking for feedback, and I'm sure you hear this, I hear this all the time, that the world, of course, is getting smaller, and our ability to connect with other communities quickly is becoming more and more important. And we know that the EA will be proceeding on high-speed rail, which is the province is proceeding with that. But I wanted to ask you about VIA for a second, because over the years, we've heard about VIA providing more reliable and better service from London through to Kitchener-Waterloo and Toronto. And there's a group called the Southwestern Ontario Transit Alliance who have met with me on a number of occasions, a lot of us, and said, look, this is not that tough a fix. If you had dedicated rail for VIA and you had slightly better equipment, the frequency of trips and the speed of the trips would be greatly enhanced. And I know VIA is a Crown corporation, it has its own sort of mandate, but as federal politicians, I wonder if you can help me to see if there's a way forward to crack that nut. Leaving aside the high-speed rail, provide Londoners with sort of a economically reasonable method of getting to Toronto, because you will know that many Torontonians now live in London and commute to Toronto to work. So I'm just wondering if you see any path forward, or is that something that's just going to sit until high-speed rail is dealt with?
Okay, I have Karen and then I have Josh, so maybe you just want to hold that. I'm sure Peter's jumping out of his skin to answer that one, so just hold that thought, Peter. We'll get to you. But good question, Councillor, so we'll come back to the answer on that. Karen?
Thanks very much. And, you know, maybe I should have taken my nice pill before I came here, but I think when we are looking at the federal government and what they've done in the last 6 months, when we talk about busy constituency offices, after the proposed finance changes, or proposed tax changes put in by the finance minister during the middle of the summer, I can tell you the feedback that I received from whether, we talk about the doctors, but we have to look at the restaurateurs, we need to look at retail shops, we need to look at a variety of different things. And I can tell you that from the work that I did, whether it was meeting with the London Chamber of Commerce or agricultural producers, this was an obvious error on the federal government because they were not looking at they did not do a proper consultation process to see how is this going to how are corporations going to be affected. And so I think the biggest thing that we have here is we have a government that has to understand local and small businesses. And that's where I think there's a huge disconnect right now. And I don't mean to be too political on this or partisan, but it's a real factor that I've seen, and it's been extremely difficult.
So, Karen, can I just interject?
Sure, of course.
I'm feeling like I am in the House.
Go for it.
Can we, what advice, I mean, your advice and your comments, I think are well taken, but what advice would you be giving to us as the municipal government? What do you hear coming through your constituency door in terms of the conditions that we, the 15 of us and Martin and his good staff have our hands on those levers? Because with the best of intentions, the Minister of Finance isn't necessarily available to us.
No, absolutely.
So,
do you know the biggest thing that you need to do is, I know I reached out to all the municipalities in our communities because there's such a search for doctors, because in our communities we have a problem with doctors, a huge doctor shortage, but we already know of doctors leaving their practices here in Canada because of these concerns. There was an announcement yesterday of an Ottawa doctor closing their doors saying, listen, I'm not doing business here. I've sat down with doctors in our area who are saying, if they're going to continue doing these sort of things, we're not going to be practicing in Canada. Look at the productivity for that community. We have to start saying, what can we do? We have councillors and we have mayors out there working really, really hard to try to promote business, to try to promote healthy communities by having all of these services available. Yet we have a disconnect where we see federal government coming out with something. The biggest thing that you need to do is have a on the ground, I'm not saying protest, but on the ground rumbling so that people are actually listening above. I was astounded. And here what we're doing is, the biggest thing for communities is making sure that the resources are in there, and that includes family doctors. We're going to be losing these family doctors if our communities do not rally behind some of these tax changes that were proposed. And so as we're going forward, we need to make sure when there are changes like that, that we're very aware of it. Our job as a federal government is to make sure that we're plowing the ground, and this is something Joe Preston, my former boss, used to always say, we have to plow the ground to create economic development. If we're continuing to put up barriers, then the people are not going to come. We're not going to see job creation. We're not going to see job expansion and things like that. So I think those are some huge concerns. With the NAFTA agreement, I really would like to say great job to Mr. Morgan, Councillor Morgan, on this. I know it was a great initiative that he took up, making sure that London is at the table when we're talking about NAFTA. It's really, really important that we do look at the region. How is it going to be affected? We know with the automobile manufacturing, we saw a huge decrease 7 and 8 years ago, and we continue to see these decreases because of things like NAFTA negotiations. But it's specifically where I am, and specifically the portion of London that I represent, we do have a lot of agricultural producers, and over 80% of those goods those commodities are going to the United States. So if we have barriers for trade, then we're going to have a huge problem for many of our agricultural producers and all of the secondary and tertiary jobs that are created because of that as well. Recognizing in Elgin, Middlesex, London, it is the second largest sector for jobs.
Okay, next segue to Councillor Morgan.
Oh, I was hoping she'd just keep going on. This would be great. No, I appreciate the comments, and I'm glad you said, you know, you didn't take your nice pill, because I'm probably feeling the same way with my comments that I'm about to make. And that is a little bit of frustration, not because of my MP colleagues who are here today, but I'm actually, through the chair and maybe to the chair, I'm having a little trouble following, you know, the order that we're doing things. I know that we seem to have an order of topics. I don't have that order. I don't have the questions that we're asking in front of me, and I want to participate effectively as a member of council, but I've seen a couple of my colleagues kind of shaking their head, and we would like to know what the plan is. We've got about a half an hour left, and I know we're talking about economic development now. I have no idea what we're talking about next. And I think we have to really think about how effective we can be with these meetings, and I think that we gotta allow councilors to have a little bit of prep for some of these topics, because I feel a little bit lost in the discussion. If I miss something, I apologize, but I don't know where we're going with some of this discussion, and I don't want to derail it, but you know, if the chair can map out the rest of this discussion, I want to participate on economic development, but I had to interject and say that because I think some of my colleagues are feeling the same thing, and I just want to have a sense on where we're going with the rest of the questions and discussion.
Well, sorry, Councillor, I assumed that everything that I was given was sent out to you yesterday, and I had, that was asked when it was final prepped, and it was sent out yesterday in terms of the city manager's talking points and the agenda for today in terms of the key points. So I apologize if you don't have that, and my understanding was it was sent out yesterday afternoon. So I'll tell you where we're going then, and along with the agenda is that we're dealing with economic development. Basically, I've read the, you know, sort of the overview, which was in Mr. Hayward's notes, and it's the same overview. And then just a couple of stimulating questions, and then we're kind of allowing the discussion to organically move where it needs to go with a few parameters in terms of really how do we work together and how do we take a Team London approach. Those are really the framing points, and what advice would our colleagues from the federal government give to us. The next area, should we have adequate time before 2:30, is into an area around environmental sustainability and looking at how do we work together in that respect, and probably most looking at the domestic action plan for phosphorus reduction. So that's really, it's not much more than that. So did you have other comments on the economic file at this time?
Yes, I do, but first I'm going to say I got the document that was mentioned. That is not necessarily what we're following. There's questions that are being asked. We're not being mapped through. That being said, we have valuable time. Our MP's time is very valuable. I'm not going to belabor this. I just think we need to find a way to make these meetings more effective in the future, and I look forward to working all of us together on ensuring that we use everybody's time very valuably. So on economic development, I do appreciate the comments about NAFTA, and I think that's something that certainly municipalities impact. There's these issues that transect the different levels of government that we're required to work very effectively and closely on. And sometimes I think what we end up doing is perhaps, you know, not collaborating in the most effective way we possibly can on these issues that involve provincial, federal, you know, municipal, and even international jurisdictions, which come up from time to time, even on funding agreements, our consultations, but it's your money, those sorts of things, and it's come up a couple of times. I guess my question for our colleagues, and because, you know, economic development is what we're talking about, but really what we're talking about is collaborating on economic development, is are we doing an effective job in communicating our intentions, our processes, our consultations with your offices? Are you getting the information you need from the city? Because I've heard today a number of questions back at us that I would have hoped could have been answered through other channels. And I want to ensure that we have very effective communications, not just here in this chamber, but on a regular basis all the time. And I've had the privilege of meeting with most of you independently and on your own, but some of the things have been said today. I'm just not sure if that would have been information I would have hoped that would have been worked out before. And I just want to know, is there anything else we need to be doing to ensure that you're getting the information you need when you need it? And do we have the proper channels in place to do that?
Peter, I'll look to you, and then I'll come over to you, Irene.
Sure. So, in fact, on that point, I'm of the view that we have a very good working rapport with one another, and we do meet one-on-one, at least I speak for myself here, and I assume it's the case for my colleagues, with councillors in our wards. and we see each other out in the community on a regular basis. This is an effective way to discuss issues, and I think it's important for the public to see, but we've done this, I think, twice now this year. I think doing it once a year might be a more effective way to go about things. So I just put that out there for colleagues to consider, because it does relate to the question about communications that Councillor Morgan raised. I will say that Martin Hayward has been absolutely wonderful to, I don't know if he's still, there he is. He's been wonderful to work with. Very straightforward, very clear. This is someone that is, as you know, I want you to recognize that as a federal representative, I see it as well. This is a man that's a tremendous asset to this city. He's been a godsend, quite frankly, to work with. On communications, I do have to say that some mixed messages on consultation dates when it comes to rapid transit. I've expressed concerns about the December date for reasons that we've heard here today. It's very close to Christmas. And I understand that there is openness to holding consultations later on, perhaps in late January into the spring. I certainly go for that, and I can guarantee you my constituents do as well. Now, on economic development when it comes to London, it was raised, and I'm not going to get into this because I want to talk about the medical sector and the tech sector, but the infrastructure bank, it's for large-scale projects, very large-scale infrastructure projects that are national in scope. Is there a private element? Yes, there is, but why should the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, for example, be investing in projects in Peru, India, and China as they do, and not here at home when it comes to infrastructure? I think that's something to consider, and I know I've talked with council colleagues on that issue, and I think it's quite obvious that there's merit in going in that direction. On Via Rail, Councillor Squire, it's an issue that continues to be looked at in terms of high frequency and what VIA has proposed. We can continue to examine that. The high-speed rail initiative is obviously a provincial matter, but I know it has gained a great deal of attention and positive attention, I have to say, on the part of certainly my constituents who I speak with. So I continue to look at that closely. I understand there's been an advisory board that's been created by the province, so we'll see where that goes, but it's encouraging. There's nothing wrong with getting to Toronto in 70 minutes. I think it would be very good for the city's growth. On small business, yes, we put out a proposal a few months ago. We heard feedback and revised. I don't want to go into the revisions. You've read the articles in the media. This is about London today, but London businesses will have a lower tax rate very soon, down to 10% in January 2018 and down to 9% in January 2019. We already have the lowest small business tax rate in the entire G7. We're leading growth in the G7 at 4.5%. And we've created 500,000 jobs since 2015. I say this because when we assumed office 2 years ago, there was a debate as to whether or not Canada was still in recession. Canada is not having that debate now. We are experiencing robust growth. Locally, I want to see that as well, and I'm encouraged by the fact that we are diversifying our economy. So back to you, colleagues, I want to understand two things. Number one, when it comes to the tech sector, have we been able to carve out a niche area in London when it comes to a particular area of tech? For instance, we have Dipley, we have Voices. Those two companies stand out, but I'm talking about a particular area, digital gaming, for example. Is it still fair when I go and advocate for London, when I'm speaking to people from across the country, when I meet with people internationally who are in Ottawa, who want to invest in communities? Do I point to the digital gaming sector? Because we've talked about that a lot as a community. Let me know your thoughts on where we are on that. And also, the medical sector. What are your views on it? In particular, where are we excelling? The medical sector is a large field. We invested $66 million for brain research at the university. That's going to carry out and going to allow those researchers to carry out cutting-edge research. But there's also medical devices that, Renishaw, for example, is doing tremendous work. Where are we on that? Is that a particular area of underneath the medical sector umbrella, if I can put it that way, that really needs to be emphasized and pushed along, because a diverse economy is the way to strengthen this city. For so long, we based our economy on manufacturing. We're starting to diversify in a major way, and I see tech and I see the medical sector as particularly important. I want to know your thoughts, if I could.
Okay, thank you. Boy, there's a mouthful there. I have Councillor Helmer, and I have Irene, and I have the mayor. So I'm going to turn to Irene, and then I'm coming to you, Councillor Helmer, and then over to the mayor. Okay, Irene?
Well, thank you very much. And to Councillor Squire, I appreciate your question and your interest in SWOTA. And they have provided a lot of very good information in regard to how we connect. I have a bill that I've introduced in the House, and it's a VIA bill. And essentially, it is intended to create a mandate for VIA. You said that it's a Crown corporation, but it doesn't have a mandate. It's never been given a mandate. So it calls for that. It calls for improvements to track maintenance, shorter freight trains, and the ability for Parliament to know when lines are being canceled, when trips are being canceled, and it compels VIA to show customer service and efficiency levels. For example, if you're taking the train to wherever you're going and you're delayed for 4 hours, the corporation has to answer to that, and they have to answer to Parliament in regard to those efficiencies, and they have to be able to show that they're improving all of that. So I hope that that works. In terms of what you're doing here, the BRT, your plans for local transit, very, very important. In the United States, where they've had incredible success with integrating their public transit, they've got the bus stopping outside of the train station. So people coming into town, they can connect easily. I'd like to see something even more regional, but I think it's perhaps beyond the scope of what we can do, because that regional connection depends on intercity buses, and they've disappeared as of 2013. So we need to focus on that particular aspect. In regard to infrastructure, I do have to say that we have an infrastructure deficit here. And while the feds may be focused on the big projects, there's a deficit here at the local community. And I have concerns about the fact that the government of Canada gave $500 million to the Chinese for their infrastructure. And it seems to me that we should be concerned about our needs at home. Last thing, and this is more of a question, and it comes back to Councillor Morgan, and I want to thank you very much for your letter in regard to involving council in discussions. One of the things that we're very, very concerned about is not hearing about what's going on with NAFTA. It seems to be a bit of a disaster, actually a big disaster. But information about CETA. We know right now, or at least in the immediate now, that under NAFTA, you have the freedom to procure locally, and no one can interfere. We don't know that about CETA. And we don't know whether or not, under CETA, you could be sued for insisting on local procurement. And that is part of economic development. That's a key part of local economic development. Your ability to support local small businesses and help them grow and thrive. So I'm glad that you're insisting on being part of the discussion, because you're on the ground. And the fact that the subnational piece is in CETA worries me very, very much.
Thanks very much. I'm going to try and cover everything I possibly can, given the amount of time we've got. One, I want to return briefly to the issue of homelessness and housing, just very briefly, because I think there's something very tangible that we could all be working on together to sort of take a Team London approach around homelessness. So the Homelessness Partnering Strategy funding, as many of you would know, is sort of divided into large designated communities and small designated communities. London is listed as a small designated community. Examples of large designated communities include Halifax and Hamilton. Hamilton receives $21 million over 5 years, with a little bit extra on top of that. London receives 2.5. That is the difference between being a large designated community and a small designated community. Now, I would say that it's probably fair to say that Hamilton's homelessness issue is actually larger than London's. If you just look at their most recent point in time counts, you know, they contacted something like 500 people. We reached about 250. Even if that's not a perfect estimate, that probably gives you the order of magnitude. So it's not, for every $1 we get, they get $8. If they have twice as many people who are dealing with homelessness, that doesn't really work, right? And I think what we need to see when the homelessness partnering strategy is renewed for future years, because really the funding was from 2014 to 2019, that's the funding I'm talking about, we need to have something that is more scalable and fair across all different kind of communities. And I think that that's something that for London specifically, we really need to sort that out. Even if the total funding is not changing, how it's allocated across communities, I think is important. And it needs to work for very small communities, but also mid-sized communities like London. I just want to get that on the table. I'm sure people want to respond to that. I'm just going to keep going because I want to speak briefly about transit. I'm surprised, frankly, that we're talking about the scheduling of meetings. And I appreciate we're being frank. I want to be clear about that. Really, it's up to us to schedule the public meetings. And I think it's a great idea to have public meetings in the beginning and middle of December. People want this information so they can think about it and look at it and give us their feedback on it. The sooner we get the information to them, the better, in my view. And so it's not like we're having it over Christmas. It's between the 11th and the 15th of December. We're a year-round operation and we've got a lot of things to do. So I appreciate it. There is a meeting tonight from 4 to 8 o'clock if you want to talk about public stations and the design of those things. There's a workshop at the Central Library about rapid transit. The next meetings, there'll be 5 of them between the 11th and the 15th of December. And I'm really looking forward to those meetings happening so people can get their hands on the alternatives for the corridors, some of the impact analysis around traffic, all these things we just discussed at a rapid transit implementation meeting last week. I think I'll leave it there. I'm interested to know on the homelessness partnering strategy where we can go on that front.
Okay, we're going to go to the mayor, and then I have Kate and I have Harold. And we're probably just going to stick, we're not going to get to the environmental sustainability issue. I think we'll just, because we've got to stop for wrap-up comments at 2:30. So, Mayor?
And I'll touch on the environmental file because I've been given an opportunity. Peter, your questions about, you know, our digital creative industry and are we still a gaming community? The answer is absolutely. I think about Big Blue Bubble, Big Viking Games. I think about Digital Extremes, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of jobs making video games for devices and then also for consoles that are sold around the world. And there are about 10,000 jobs in this field, 10 to 11,000 jobs overall in digital creative. There are between 500 and 1,000 job openings. And these are well-paying jobs, and these are jobs that attract young people to our community. So this is a key economic focus for us and for the LEDC as well. And so thank you very much for that question. I want to talk a little bit about citywide benefits for rapid transit, because I know that, you know, Kate, you and I have had this opportunity to talk many times about this. I think it's a good idea to talk about it in a public setting as well, because what we've talked about before are things like a citywide benefit, fight congestion. We have congestion problems across the city. We have congestion problems in Byron. There's no question about that. Over the next couple of decades, we're going to see 70,000 more Londoners move to this community, 40,000 more cars. And so the rapid transit implementation problem is looking to fight congestion. If that person in Byron never gets out of their vehicle, there are benefits from a congestion fighting perspective. Keeping our community affordable is another community-wide investment because we are an economic ecosystem. And so if we look at our downtown, for example, really the cornerstone of the London plan, building inward and upward, that's the most efficient way to grow. We're a massively expensive community to operate because we're about 2/3 the size of Toronto with about 20% the population. And so we spread the costs out of running a city over a much smaller group. So when we can keep costs low for our community, then that means there's economic benefit everywhere. Greener parks in London West, better roads across the community, and lower taxes as well. I think another space to look at is the environment. Your government is very focused, as they should be, on greenhouse gas reductions. And by investing in transit in this way, this is the single largest thing that our community can do to help you in that effort to reduce greenhouse gases. And it's not the emissions that the bus is creating, whether it's electric or diesel. We're leaning towards electric, but it's the cars that are no longer on the road, and I think that's important too. One of the key messages, and I know we've talked about this before, and I think it's important to talk about in this public forum as well, is that rapid transit is a citywide program. It's better transit everywhere. It's 35% improvements in service right across the entire city, not just along those corridors. And so picture, if you will, a bus that takes 40 minutes or an hour between pickups. If it's connected to a rapid transit line, imagine every 10 minutes, because that's what the plan is calling for. So every 10 minutes, you can predict that a bus is going to be at the stop closest to your home. And then when you get to a rapid transit line, every 5 minutes, you're going to see a vehicle travel along that corridor. That lends itself to predictability, reliability, efficiency. It allows a person to be spontaneous wherever they live in the city, to be able to access the line and get to where they need to go. And I think lastly, from a community development perspective, citywide benefits perspective, it's an economic development strategy. And I'll go back to the London plan. By changing the way that we grow more inward and upward, we're definitely more efficient. We also can avoid spending $300 million on road widenings. Now, what does that mean? It helps keep our development charge lower because those projects are not in the system. But what it also does is it means we're not building $300 million worth of roads that we then need to maintain through the support of the tax base. And lastly, and we're already seeing it, the corridors that have been identified are seeing investments being made, and the kind of investments that we want to see being made in the city. The high rises. If you look in the Richmond Street corridor, you can already see, just adjacent to the Masonville lands, investment occurring there. You can see cranes in the sky in our downtown. You're going to see more cranes in the sky in our downtown. And again, we're that economic ecosystem. So if that person living in Byron never steps foot on a bus, there are going to be benefits for them. And I know what we need to do. We need to make sure that we have a hotline of communication for your constituency office to our rapid transit office to make sure that those answers can be available to you so that then you can communicate them to your constituents, because your constituents are our constituents too. We're all in this together. So I really appreciate that question. Thank you.
Councillor Usher, and sorry, I think I mentioned Kate first and then Councillor Usher. Kate.
Well, thank you, Mayor Brown, for talking about the communication, Matt. If I had 10 cents for every time I've heard, you know, if we could do the communication better, I think we'd all be very rich. And I've lived that my entire life, and I know it's a challenge, but it is, the devil's in the details. And so we need to be able to talk to our constituents and get your message out just as much as we are getting our message out. And I think that's why it's important to have meetings like this so that we can all understand what we're trying to accomplish together. I did want to mention Councillor Squire, your comment about VIA, and Peter's already mentioned that, but I did want to talk about, you know, they do want this designated line. But the one thing I think that we need to do in not just London, but Southwestern Ontario is really have that discussion with the province, with VIA Rail, and talk about, well, what are you all planning to do over the next 5 to 10 years? Because I don't think there has been that discussion. As I used to be parliamentary secretary for transport, and that was one of my concerns, and it still is a concern of mine as a representative in London, is what does the future hold for VIA and high speed? So that's an area that I'd like to pursue, and I think that we should actually get people around a table and talk about what all the lines mean, because it will have an impact on us moving forward. As far as economic development, I did want to mention that Peter is the chair of the Southwestern Ontario Caucus, Liberal Caucus, and we do meet about some of the concerns that we have in this area. And we're always talking about how we want to make sure that we're being heard, as much as Kitchener-Waterloo. Because, let's face it, Kitchener-Waterloo gets a lot of ink. And we need to get a lot of ink. And so we're there, and I know that Irene and Karen are there singing from the same songbook, that we are important, and we want the federal government to know how important it is that London is at the top of the pack, that we are always seen as the very middle point of southwestern Ontario. And so that's our role, is to make sure people don't forget about how important London is to the entire country.
Thank you, Kate. I'm going to look to Councillor Usher, and then we're going to come back for 2-minute closing wrap-ups. And Peter, you can integrate your comments into that. Councillor Usher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do respect the timing that we have. I just wanted to take this in a little bit different direction at this point in time. I do respect all the conversations that's happening here, but I just want to bring this at a different level, and I'm going to take it to the national level. Because first of all, I want to thank our MPs for being here, and I want to thank them also for each of them agreeing to meet with groups of us from FCM Board of Directors next week at different times. I think some of you are meeting on the 21st and some are meeting on the 23rd, and I believe that I'm going to be involved in each of your meetings, hopefully anyway. So a lot of these things, one of the reasons that we are meeting next week, we always meet in November at this time in order to advocate with the MPs for them to find out from us what, for us, meaning all the municipalities nationally across, and therefore we have to cut it down to a few subjects that we are talking about. And the whole reason for this in November is so that we can come to some understanding about what is what the Minister of Finance could or will put into his budget in 2018, March 2018. So we pretty well know the numbers that will be there. It's the details and the formulas that we are not aware of yet. And we know the subject matter because it's infrastructure such as transit, roads, water, and national housing strategy. Hopefully we'll get some details by then. And of course, transportation. And one of the things that we don't talk about here too much, but the rural communities talk about is broadband, and that will be addressed also. So those are some of the things that we will be talking about in their office in Ottawa next week. So all this information here is very good, so that when we get together, you won't hear about all of this, but you'll hear about some of them at a whole different level. The point I want to make then is that FCM is our representative at the national level, and they are at the table with the federal government. They may not speak directly to our MPs, but they speak to the ministers, they speak to the Minister of Finance, they speak to the Prime Minister, and that's one of the reasons why we are meeting next week, so that we could come together and talk about some of those things that they know about and we know about, and we collaborate and we reinforce what they could take to the table, to the House, and be in agreement with the Prime Minister and so on. So I really, really appreciate the fact that they're here for that reason. And I just wanted to bring that out, and I want to thank them and let them know that I'll be seeing them next week in their office in Ottawa. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. I know that'll be significant and full days ahead on that. So I'm going to look for wrap-up comments, and we'll go in reverse alphabetical order. So we'll start with you, Karen.
That makes it
By
really,
last name.
By last name. That makes it really easy. Well, thank you once again for having these meetings. It is really important that we do have these conversations all the time. Harold, I see that I have you in my calendar for 9:30 next Thursday, and that, and I believe that's the day after the National Housing Strategy will be coming out. It is dated to come out on the 22nd, so we'll see if that comes out that day. I am looking forward to it, and as the Shadow Minister, I'll make sure, I think part of my thing is to make sure that it is as ground level as possible. I think we need to work at ground zero to make sure that these initiatives are going well. And that's the one thing that I have seen in my 13 years of experience in federal government, is that it really needs to be a partnership, and that the people on the ground who are actually doing the work have those relationships. One thing that we have not addressed today, and I do want to bring it up, and just for your minds, the marijuana legislation, of course, is coming up on July 1st, 2018 for implementation. I'm very concerned with, do we have the work done in our communities? Or do we have our police officers? Do they have the drug recognition done? Do they have the training that's needed? What's being done there, and how is the municipality going to be dealing with that? I think that's an issue that is really paramount at the federal, provincial, and municipal governments right now, that we need to converse on. I'm not saying that I'm going against legislation. What I'm saying is, are the communities ready? And that is one of the biggest things that we're going to be challenged with in the next 6 months or 7 months. Are you ready to proceed with that? So I really hope that we can continue that conversation in the next time we meet. And meanwhile, my door is always open. Of course, I am the Shadow Minister for Family, Children, and Social Development. So I deal from everything from old age security and housing to child benefits and the new employment insurance stuff that was announced last week. Those are things that all fall under me. So I'm happy to have those discussions with you, whether it's saying it's a great program, bravo it, or saying we need to change some things. Those are the types of things that we need to do. And I do really appreciate working with my fellow colleagues here. I've worked very closely with them all in different perspectives, but thank you very much for having today's meeting.
Thank you. I will turn to Kate Young.
Well, thank you very much. Again, this has been a pleasure, and I want to be able to continue discussions like this as much as possible, because I think as long as we're doing this, the lines of communication will keep open, and we'll get those questions answered. I did want to touch on something again, that we didn't get a chance to, and that's just Western and Fanshawe. And with my hat on as Parliamentary Secretary to Science, I am just so impressed with the amount of research that is going on at both of the institutions in London. And I really think that dovetails nicely with the medical, with what we're doing as far as medicine is concerned in London. And we can't forget that they are really, both Fanshawe and Western, really talk about, I mean, they really connect with how we will develop as a city. And I know that we didn't mention them throughout the entire meeting, and I just wanted to make sure that we did, because they are so important to our future. Thank you.
Irene?
Well, thank you, and I appreciate this opportunity to dialogue and hear from you. I think that this team and the team in London is very, very strong. I like the idea of the hotline to the constituency office. Please know that that constituency office is open to receiving whatever you need in terms of communicating information or receiving information. I also thought it might be a good idea, and you may regret this, I don't know, that I put councillors on my email blast, or we all do, because we do things in the House. Some of them are good, some of them are naughty. But the good things that we do in terms of proposing legislation or cultivating ideas, if we could communicate that to you directly, then you would know what we were up to, and we could share information that way. In regard to keeping the community affordable, in light of what's happening in housing prices with people coming from Toronto, I think that is very, very key. And we're right back to affordable housing, social housing, co-ops and nonprofits. Let's bring that sector back, and whatever you need to do to convince the federal government that that kind of investment is important, please do it, because it means the housing stock increases, and that keeps things affordable. We could use some retrofitting of our buildings. That should be in the next budget. I would like to see that very much, because it comes right back to the environment and our concerns around climate change, extreme weather, and the fact that you have to clean it up. If there's flooding, if there is some kind of disaster that was preventable because we were better behaved in regard to preserving our environment, that falls to municipalities. So I think work in that regard, a national strategy in terms of your anti-poverty strategy. You can only go so far, and we need the feds involved. And my last word is a pitch for my Thames River bill. It seeks to address the issue of a lost Environmental Protection Act that's been gutted, the gutting of the Navigable Protection Waters Act. Waters have been removed from that, and now it's just navigation. Species at risk, and the Fisheries Act. All of those need to come back in full strength. because we need to protect that river, we need to protect the water, because as you know, downriver, people are drinking that water, and we have a stewardship obligation in that regard. So thank you again for your time and your input, and I look forward to as many of these opportunities as we can make possible.
Peter?
Thank you very much. Thanks for everyone's time today. It was great to have the discussion. A point was made earlier about infrastructure projects and an apparent delay in the process. In fact, if you look at the numbers, infrastructure projects across the country have been approved. Enormous investment has been made. Have they all come at once? No, because we have put together the most ambitious infrastructure investment policy that we have seen as a country. This is very ambitious indeed. And so it does take time when you have municipalities across the country that are seeking financial support for their particular projects. So I would ask colleagues to keep that in mind as well. Councillor Helmer raised the issue of fair share. Point taken, Jesse, on that. In fact, it's an issue that we continue to advocate for. And in fact, we've made great progress in that regard. Mid-sized cities such as London are getting attention, a great deal more attention than they received in the past. We, in this city, have seen millions of dollars invested in a variety of areas, from infrastructure to research support to you name it. We've been doing rather well, and I want that certainly to continue, but I'm glad you brought up the point, because that particular program is very important. I do have to respond to the comment that you made, Councillor, on consultation dates. You and I have known each other, I think, for close to 10 years, and we have very good rapport, but I have to be frank in my response. When the federal government is being asked to contribute hundreds of millions of dollars towards bus rapid transit, I think it's fair for me to at least ask a question about consultation dates on the part of constituents, certainly, and I see their point about a December consultation. You know, we're not telling you when to schedule it. We're simply passing along, I'm simply passing along that particular concern. I just wanted to come back with that, just to be clear where the concern is coming from. The last point, colleagues, I'll say, please go back and when you're in your wards talking with your constituents, tell them about the Canada Child Benefit. This is an important program. In London North Centre alone, nearly 16,000 children are benefiting from the CCB. It's had a tremendous impact in generating economic growth across the country. That's not a partisan point, that comes straight from the Bank of Canada. It's lifted 300,000 children out of poverty. I know that this community is dealing with child poverty, and it's a particular challenge. I believe, is it Richmond, British Columbia, and Toronto and Windsor that are ahead of us in terms of poverty rates, but when we rank 4th in the country, that's a particular, a real concern for all of us in this room. I talked before about marginalized citizens, and we are less when our most marginalized are left behind. Perhaps under that, we can look at children. We need to be advocates for those kids, and the Canada Child Benefit does that. So that'll be my last point. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, though.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much for a couple of things. One is thank you for your service. I think I've said this before, there's only a few people in this community that truly understand what public service is all about and what it costs individuals, and it's those who are on one side of the other of the ballot box, whether it be federally or provincially or municipally. And so we thank you for that on our behalf, and on behalf of the 362,000 Londoners. We thank you for your ongoing work on all of our behalfs. The other part is, it's really obvious as I listen that we are best when we dialogue and we exchange things, and it's not about scoring any political points, it's about an exchange of ideas. And I appreciate the perspectives that each one of you have brought today. And obviously there's areas of convergence and there's areas of divergence, but we are better when there's that political tension, and that's what makes us better. And I always believe that tension and conflict are actually good because they make us sharper. You do not sharpen an axe if there's no edge and no tension or stress on that axe. So we make ourselves better. I am reminded actually of just how important communication is when we try and bring transformational initiatives forward that are big, big change initiatives, and how challenging that is. And I think the shift hotline's a great idea. I think we can very quickly implement that. And one of the things that we didn't mention too is just some of the work we're doing with First Nations. I think we're really trying to move that agenda forward in a sensitive way and in an appropriate way, and following the lead out of the Truth and Reconciliation report that has come forward. And I think we're all on board with that. And finally, something I was reminded of last week was a quote by Jack Welch, and he said this: "Please bring me solutions to problems that I can change with the stroke of a pen." And wouldn't it be nice if we could solve some of these issues with the stroke of a pen? I think Councillor Helmer, the one thing that he said, to me, that's almost a stroke of a pen, Peter, you know, moving us from that small community category to that large community category. That would be a really nice stroke of a pen. But so much of what we do is very complicated and challenging, and yet together we can move forward and make substantive difference for our community. So I thank you for your time this afternoon. I thank Martin. Thank you for enduring this different format. We worked this out, Roxanne Wilcox and Martin and the government relations folks, to try a different approach to it, a little bit more free-flowing, and I'll look forward to hearing your feedback on it after we're done and offline. So with that, I'll look for a motion to adjourn.
Another motion before that,
What's that?
if I could.
You may.
Thank you, Chair. I think we need to have a motion to receive Mr. Hayward's report, and I think we should also extend in a formal way our appreciation to all of our colleagues at the federal level for taking the time to be here today.
Okay. So I'll take talk with you.